Welcome to episode 2 of Ask the Librarian at the Philip Roth Personal Library at the Newark Public Library. We take questions posted on our social media accounts, questions which seem straightforward at first glance, but because nothing is ever that simple, you'll always get a complex answer. Enjoy! Question is, did Roth own any books by authors from South America, particularly from Brazil? Yes. Excuse my pronunciations. Here we go. We have Machado de Assis, several books in the collection, including Epitaph of a Small Winner, which we have right here. Unfortunately, this one does not have any of Roth's writing, but it does have like underlining and parts that Roth emphasized in the book. So here we are on one of the first pages. And then so sometimes you'll see he made a vertical line next to a paragraph, or sometimes just underlining. So this kind of marking occurs throughout the first part of this book. And from Brazil, we also have Clarice Lispector, The Passion According to G.H., and also Carmen L. Oliveira, Rare and Commonplace Flowers, No Annotations. Argentina, we have several authors represented, including Jorge Luis Borges, selected nonfictions, which does include underlining, Julio Cortázar, and The Game, no annotations, and Alberto Manguel, A History of Reading, no annotations. Colombia, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, several novels but no annotations. From Peru, Mario Vargas Llosa, several works, no annotations, only personal notes in the book. And Chile, Antonio Scarmeta, Burning Patience, no annotations. And Roth also owned the anthology called A Hammock Beneath the Mangoes, Stories from Latin America, anthology of various authors from Latin America. Obrigado por sua pergunta. Question 2. Did Roth have any works translated from Arabic, and are they annotated? A few, but not that many. So in terms of fiction, we have one called The Trench by Abdelrahman Munif, translated from the Arabic by Peter Thoreau. That one did not have any annotations. And then A Life Full of Holes, a novel tape recorded in Maghrebi and translated into English by Paul Bowles, which was originally written by Driss Ben Hamen Sharhadi. And then a copy of Arabian Nights, no annotations either. And Roth also owned a few compilations by Clinton Bailey focused on the Bedouins. So there was Bedouin poetry from Sinai and Negev, Bedouin war poems from the Negev, poetry of the desert, and then a fourth title called Bedouin Proverbs. Other than fiction books, the nonfiction collection included several books about Jewish-Arab relations and about the Middle East, and some of those are annotated, but I think you're probably referring to works of literature. Also, perhaps of interest, you probably already know that the request included more than books. We received selected furniture, awards, diplomas, vinyl records, radios, academic robes, some posters, 3 typewriters, and a little bit of artwork. Some of these items may have been left over after the auction. One of these items includes a framed manuscript from Roth's home in Connecticut, which unfortunately lacks any identifying information. When I visited the residence to document all of the books, I don't recall seeing this piece. It appears to be a Persian manuscript depicting a hunting scene. We have many questions, the chief one being, how did Roth acquire this leaf? And when? And what is its significance? We know only that it was framed in a store in Woodbury, Connecticut, and we don't know when it was created, possibly in the 17th century. 3. What book did Philip Roth own the most copies of? It's a challenging question, again, for several reasons. That is because the bequest also included all of Roth's own copies of his novels. So if you can imagine a large attic in his home in Connecticut that was just full of his novels, I think that the most copies we have are probably of The Breast. So if I'm looking at the question that way, I would address it by saying certainly the most copies we have of Philip Roth's books, probably The Breast. And then secondly, as you're probably familiar, Roth edited a series called The Writers from the Other Europe. This was an effort to promote these voices that were otherwise not heard in the United States. So Roth had many copies of these works as well, scattered on shelves throughout those residences or also stored in the attic. So let me address your question by examining standalone titles. This becomes convoluted too because Roth could have owned, for example, many copies of Saul Bellows novels, but then later on, in later years, these works could have been published in an anthology, such as the Library of America series, or say Roth owned several thin paperbacks of a play by Chekhov, let's say The Cherry Orchard, and then this play is included in other editions or compilations. So let's say the 5 plays of Chekhov, or Chekhov's greatest works, or The Cherry Orchard and other plays. So I'm going to respond to this question by referring to the single-owned, standalone titles of a bound edition of a book. When I list these, keep in mind that there could be 6 different copies of a work, but they might be various editions. And it's not surprising that more than one copy contains Roth's annotations. The winner is Richard Stern's Other Men's Daughters. Roth has 7 copies of that book, which were located again throughout various rooms of the 2 residences. Roth and Stern were dear friends, and Roth penned the introduction for one of the editions of this title. The 2 met in 1956 when Roth was teaching at the University of Chicago. Roth writes that he considered Other Men's Daughters a masterpiece. And 6 copies of Flaubert's Madame Bovary and Nabokov's Lolita. And if you're curious, 5 copies of Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, and this was also a book that Roth taught at Hunter College, Bernard Malamud's The Assistant, and Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Question number 4. What are the most recently published books in the collection? First thing to keep in mind is Philip Roth died on May 22nd, 2018. And then a few months after his passing, we got the opportunity to visit his 2 residences, his apartment in New York City and his home in Connecticut, in order to begin documenting the arrangement of the books. So I took photographs of every shelf in every room, and then piles of books. So piles of books on the coffee table or a nightstand or on the floor in the living room, for example. And those had to be kept in the same order once we were given approval to transfer those books over here, which didn't occur until almost 2 years later. So when you do visit the Philip Roth Personal Library, the books that you see on display are arranged the way that Philip Roth had them. So beginning with the books from the New York City apartment, because we were allowed to obtain those first, followed by the books from his Connecticut home, room by room. When we inspected the books in Roth's residences immediately after his death, we discovered piles of unopened mailers, particularly in his home in Connecticut. And that is because publishers, editors, and authors would send new works to Philip Roth all the time, hoping to get feedback or a review, or especially a blurb that could go on the back of a book. And unfortunately, as I mentioned before, we waited quite a while, almost over 2 years, to hear back from the state that we were finally able to retrieve the books because we had to wait for the two residences to be sold first. And by that time, some of the mailers had been opened, so it was difficult to tell what was part of the collection that Roth had read. So maybe on a table, there were some books that had originally been in mailers that were unopened, others were still in their envelopes. So sometimes we had to go back to our documentation, so the photographs of the shelves and the piles on the tables that we had seen in 2018. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that Roth read those books. For example, there was a book that was given to Roth a month before his death called Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna by Edith Schaefer. And Roth had never opened the envelope and he never read this book, but it's part of the collection. To answer your question, I will give you 3 titles. Lisa Halliday's Asymmetry from 2018. This copy was inscribed to Roth 3 months before his death. Racing Against History, the 1940 Campaign for a Jewish Army to Fight Hitler by Rick Richman. This was given to Roth 3 months before his death, and that was filed in Roth's living room in New York. So he had at least opened it and put it on a shelf. And Steven Zipperstein's Pogrom, Kishinev, and the Tilt of History from 2018, which was inscribed by Zipperstein to Roth on March 23rd, 2018. And this book, in fact, did contain markings, and we know he read it. We know he read it not only from the annotations, but in 2018, Philip Roth was interviewed by the New York Times, and this article was published on January 16th of 2018. It was titled, "No Longer Writing, Philip Roth Still Has Plenty to Say." And in the article, Roth does say, pre-publication copies of books arrive regularly in the mail, and that's how I discovered Steven Zipperstein's Pogrom, Kishinev, and the Tilt of History. Zipperstein pinpoints to the moment at the start of the 20th century when the Jewish predicament in Europe turned deadly in a way that foretold the end of everything.